Thanks, everyone. Please sit down. Welcome to day 2. I hope you enjoyed the first day of our meeting, and we have another exciting agenda, so we should get started. So yesterday we talked about the economics of zero-dose children. Today we're talking about something else, but also very, very important. So in the morning we'll talk about donor transitions, so both the traditional ones from Gavi support, but also the current crisis that we've seen this year where the US government has suddenly stopped their support. We'll be discussing that and how countries are managing that. And in the afternoon we're talking about vaccine portfolio optimization and prioritization, also very much linked of course to the new resource-constrained environment. And so why are we talking about that? So the background, the rationale behind this is, so US government cuts have left large gaps in countries' budgets. At the same time, Gavi's replenishment has, for the first time ever, not met its targets, triggering this recalibration exercise. And so now more than ever, countries need to carefully plan and budget for their immunization programs, allocate resources efficiently, and consider economic evidence in decision making. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So this is our agenda for today. So the first session will be about Gavi transition preparations, and we'll be discussing how countries can increase domestic resources for immunization. Then after that we'll have a short break, and after that we'll have a panel discussion to talk about experience from different countries and how they've been managing these US government cuts for immunization programs. Then after that we'll kick off a chai session where they'll have a panel discussion to talk about how countries have been managing vaccine portfolio optimization. After that, we'll do a group photo here in the room before we break for lunch. After that, we'll have a session first with a presentation on combination vaccines. And after that, Gavi will be presenting their experiences and looking forward on how they approach vaccine portfolio optimization. We'll have a break after that, and then we'll talk about capacity strengthening to use economic evidence in decision making. So who should be trained and on what and so on. And the final session will be about tools to do this and the way forward. So what kind of tools do countries and global level decision makers need to use economic evidence in decision making for programs? So here are some of the questions that we would like you to focus on today while you're going through the sessions. So the first is, what can we learn from the challenges and successes of Gavi transitioning countries to ensure immunization programs are adequately financed? Second, how can countries better optimize their vaccine portfolios to maximize impact with limited resources? And how can we improve the use of economic evidence in decision making? And what additional evidence and tools do we need to make that happen? So with that, we'll immediately kick off for the first session. I'll hand over to our moderator for the session, Alex from UNICEF. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. I hope you had a good day, a nice, relaxing evening yesterday. I will not take too much time. I just wanted to thank Well for asking UNICEF to chair this session, because this is a topic that really is dear to myself, and I am interested in it, in the conversation that's going to happen. I just wanted to acknowledge the panel members. I will start with Anthony from Gavi, just to make sure you are here. Logan, I don't know, Soazic, and Daniel. So we will start, just an introduction, a quick one is to say that we were talking with Laura about transition and how countries can transition from aid, but it's exactly the same conversation that we are having right now with the UN agencies and some of the partners. We are also transitioning from aid, basically. It's a transition that we find difficult on a personal, at a personal level, organization level. We are all transitioning. And we realize suddenly how difficult it is to transition from something that is established, that we thought was going to be forever. And the countries live that way. They actually live in the mindset that it's going to be here. Where is Gavi going to go anyway? And where is the bank going to go? They are going to be here. And I want to share one example one situation last year in one of the countries where there was a mission from 2 different donors to the same country 3 weeks apart, and I was in those two missions from the country perspective, and then I realized suddenly when you move from a prescriber side, where I was 4 or 5 years ago with UNICEF at headquarters, and then move to the countryside, where you become the patient and you see the donors coming, you realize that it's really not efficient. Because we have 2 donors investing a lot of money in this country. When they came 3 weeks apart, they really met the same people in the Ministry of Health, in the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, the same people. And we went around the same cycle, and then we heard the same speeches. And then I started wondering, what is happening? I mean, are we really here to help the countries? So this conversation is important. Let's have an open debate. Difficult conversation. It's always difficult to talk about money, but I hope we will all have, learn from our colleagues and have some good recommendation after this session. So let's start with the first one. Anthony from Gavi. Yes, you work for the Sustainability Finance and Immunization team. We will hear from the IF&S work on transition. And I hope just please 10 minutes, please.
I'll try my best to stay within time. So hello everyone, my name is Anthony Nguyen. I work on Gavi's Immunization, Financing and Sustainability team. I've been with Gavi since about 2021, so I consider myself still relatively new to Gavi. Even more new to this group. This is my first meeting with Immunization Economics, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And let's get started. I will kick us off this morning by talking about sustainable transition from Gavi's perspective. The plan is to talk a little bit about the Gavi model and its vision for transition. I assume most people in the room will be quite familiar with this, but just to put us on the same page and to introduce it for people who are less familiar, we'll go over it quickly. I'll talk a bit about kind of what sustainability and transitions look like from Gavi in numbers, primarily told through co-financing, which is where my team does most of its work. I'll give one kind of country example and then talk about kind of what transition is looking like for the next 5 years and what we call kind of Gavi 6.0 period, 2026 through 2030. So on this slide you have a visual depiction of the Gavi model. So Gavi's mission is to prevent deaths, protect health through the increased equitable and sustainable use of vaccines. We do that by working across different areas that are kind of the colored boxes in this graph. So working on long-term funding, pooling the demand, accelerating access, our market-shaping activities, strengthening delivery, and for our discussion here today, facilitating sustainable transition and immunization programs. Gavi, so what does successful transition look like to Gavi? This was a vision articulated by the Gavi board in 2015. It's summarized here in these kind of 3 outputs for our transition countries. They have successfully expanded their portfolio with programs of public health importance. Countries are able to sustain this portfolio with high coverage, equitable coverage, and countries have robust systems that can help and process these to facilitate the introduction of new vaccines. The primary tool that Gavi has to facilitate transition is our co-financing, eligibility, and transition policies, known kind of collectively as the El-Traco model. So you have that kind of depicted in this graphic. I heard feedback recently that this was a confusing graphic to some people, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about this to make sure we're all on the same page, as it will be important as we talk about kind of the rest of the impacts of co-financing. So if you look at this graphic, I guess the easiest way I kind of interpret it is, imagine you're a country and it's showing kind of your transition timeline as you move from the left to the right, right? So the height, the bars, is the total vaccine cost of Gavi-supported vaccines per country. And as you move from the left to the right, you're moving across the years. And as your GNI changes, hopefully it's increasing, the colored kind of shaded parts is the share of co-financing of this total cost you're expected to pay. So the co-financing part, right? So kind of imagine you're all the way on the left, you're a low-income country. As you move along, you hit 2 thresholds, which are important. So one is the low income threshold. This is kind of yellow vertical line. So last year, that's a threshold defined by the World Bank for what is considered a low income country. So that's 1,145 GNI per capita last year. Everything below, countries that fall below this are co-financing at a minimum kind of flat level across all their programs. Once you pass that, then the kind of transition journey really kicks up and you start paying increasing shares of co-financing at a scheduled rate, right? Until you hit the second threshold, which is this kind of orange vertical line in the middle, but it's known as the Gavi eligibility threshold. So last year that was 1,820 GNI per capita, and that's a threshold defined by Gavi. When you hit that, technically you are no longer qualified for Gavi support, and you're transitioning out, right? So countries who move from this middle part, preparatory transition, when they hit that point, they become what we call accelerated transition, and now we're ramping their co-financing up at a higher rate until they eventually transition out and become kind of these green bars where you're now paying 100% of the financing for your Gavi supported vaccines. So those are the transition countries. We sometimes call them mixed, self-financed, variety of names. It all means the same thing. And there's 8 years at kind of that last phase. So what this looks like in practice, on this chart here, you have the total co-financing paid by all countries since the co-financing policy has started. It's grouped in kind of five-year periods. But what you can see is kind of the very steep increase in co-financing that's been paid by countries. If you look at kind of this last bar, so for the Gavi 5.0 period, 21 through 25, we're expecting countries to pay about 1.1 billion in co-financing by the end of this year. And kind of cumulatively over this period, by the end of the year, we'll have hit 2 billion in co-financing paid. This chart here shows sources of funding for co-financing. So this is a view over the past 6 years. If you look at, let's start with 2024. The blue part is basically saying 84% co-financing paid by countries has come from domestic resources. If you cut that across the past 6 years, it's an average about 86% for all countries. And the orange bits, which are kind of the other big piece of source of funding for co-financing, is World Bank loans, right? And across the past 6 years, that's an average of 11%. With regards to World Bank loans, up until 2024, almost all of this money was going to one country, which was Nigeria. In 2024, we saw a change where there's a greater number of countries now that are using World Bank loans in their co-financing. So last year, 6 countries took out loans from the World Bank to pay their co-financing, and the majority of this, 98%, went to countries in the accelerated transition. So I'm rushing through this, but we can come back and discuss details afterwards. So I've been speaking about co-financing so far, which is only one part of country vaccine financing needs. There's another big element, which is traditional vaccine financing. So the vaccines that countries are procuring outside of Gavi support. Thanks to our UNICEF colleagues, as of last year, we're starting to get more data on this. So this is a view in 2024. So looking at only Gavi eligible countries of all kind of their country procurement costs, what you see is 71% was going towards Gavi supported vaccines. That's through co-financing payments, and almost 30%, 29, went towards traditional vaccines. And this is an aggregate view on the country level. This ratio can look very, very different, right? We have sources of funding data for traditional vaccines as well. Right now, at least in 2024, it's still predominantly coming through domestic channels. But you can see the makeup of some of the other sources of funding is a little bit different. So the World Bank loan element is smaller, and in this case, we have a greater share that's being paid directly by UNICEF, so 17% in 2024. So far I've been talking about kind of financing and particularly co-financing in the aggregate level. Here, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some countries. So kind of during the timeline, since 2008, since the implementation of mandatory co-financing to now, we've transitioned out 19 countries from Gavi support. So kind of under the green and orange arrows here, you can see which countries transitioned out in the year they became fully self-financing. In blue, you have the countries that we expect to transition out of Gavi support in the next 5 years. So that's Bangladesh, Djibouti, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. So here's one example for Cote d'Ivoire, kind of what that transition timeline looks like in terms of co-financing paid. right? So if you think about the Gavi model from earlier, kind of moving left to the right, the first data point here is the first kind of co-financing payment for Cote d'Ivoire in 2009. They were a low-income, fragile country at the time, and they had one Gavi supported program, which they paid $197,000 in co-financing for. They moved to PT, kind of crossing that next threshold in 2015, with two Gavi supported programs, and the co-financing had already started to ramp up to about $970,000. Right. Fast forward 7 years, the country crossed the Gavi eligibility threshold. It's now an accelerated transition country, so it's in this last stage where we're ramping them up to 100% financing their vaccines and transitioning them out of Gavi support. Last year, in 2025, or this year, sorry, in 2025, we expect about 12 million in co-financing to be paid by Cote d'Ivoire, and that's for 7 programs, not including IBE, which has no co-financing. So kind of you can see from 2022, when they enter AT, to the point they leave in 2030, kind of the gradient of the co-financing paying is quite steep, right? And under kind of current projections, we expect them to pay in 2030 roughly 35 million, so tripling what they're paying right now for their programs. And that's going to be for about 9 programs. So I'm not going to read through all this, but just to say that apart from our eligibility transition and co-financing policy, the other kind of tool that we have to help countries through transition is Gavi, along with alliance partners, works on transition planning, transition roadmaps. Cote d'Ivoire also picked this example because there's a couple of important milestones and actions that they took over the past couple of years to facilitate their transition. I won't read through all this right now, but just to say it has resulted in something that happened last year, which is the Abidjan Declaration. So in July of 2024, 9 countries, led by Cote d'Ivoire in the region, adopted the Abidjan Declaration, which commits them to support, to transitioning from Gavi support through a number of kind of concrete commitments to action, right? So if you read through the text, there's about 10 different action points. I try to summarize them here in a couple of bullets, but they're all related to mobilizing and increasing domestic resources for immunization, better integrating immunizations at country planning, setting up monitoring mechanisms, regional learning, and monitoring, and increasing political commitment at the higher. Which brings me to the last slide, and I'll stop here, which is to say, when we look at kind of the role that transition plays in the Gavi model from earlier, going forward, in particular in the context where, the countries are transitioning out support and we're transitioning out donor support, as Alex mentioned, Gavi is making some drastic changes to the way it operates, right? And this was captured in a paper that was published earlier called the Gavi Leap. You can look it up here, but it kind of outlines Gavi's vision for how it plans to operate over the next period and to, quote unquote, put itself out of business. But a key component of this is basically putting heightened emphasis on kind of country ownership, country decision-making on the transition piece. It is something that underpins structural changes that are happening right now within the Secretariat, but also kind of intent of how we plan to work with partners, the potential impacts on global architecture, etc. And I'll stop there and you get back to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we will move to Logan immediately. We'll have a few minutes later.
And WordPress. All right. Good morning, everyone. Anthony and I did not coordinate our presentations, but they kind of nicely blend together. So I wanted to provide some background and kind of try to address this question, whether countries are really poised to successfully transition from donor support and using Gavi as an example. So you've learned about the co-financing model. I think one thing that I would highlight is that co-financing does not involve an exchange of money. Countries are not paying Gavi. Co-financing is actually a co-procurement mechanism. So Gavi procures their share of the vaccine. Let's say it's a pentavalent vaccine, and the country is responsible for procuring another share of vaccine. And so that's also important because it helps to build that muscle at the country level in terms of forecasting, procurement, and readiness for transition. Um, you've already heard about the countries that have transitioned. But since the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that countries were affected, their macroeconomic situations were affected, and so in that environment, can countries continue to successfully transition? So the four countries that Anthony pointed out are the countries that are on track to transition by 2030. There's a total of 9 countries that we're not quite sure the direction that they're going to go in because we don't know kind of the pathway or the GNI. But this group here in the accelerated transition is the group that I'm going to talk about a little bit for this talk. So I wanted to look at coverage, and these are the countries that have already transitioned, and these are the latest figures. And basically, this group has gained 2 percentage points between 2018 and 2024. So coverage has mostly really remained flat. Countries like Bolivia have had a kind of a backsliding or a downturn in their coverage rates. And Gavi has mechanisms in place to try to help the countries that have transitioned to support their programs. But comparing that with the coverage rates in accelerated transitioning countries, the median value has remained flat. So there's really been no change as between 2018 and 2024 as a group over that period of time. And Papua New Guinea is down here at the bottom, followed by Nigeria. But there's a nice uptick for some of those countries between 2023 and 2024. When looking at different sort of economic indicators for these different countries, what you can see obviously is the GNI per capita is much higher in the transition countries, and actually for the first 19 countries, we often refer to them as a first wave of countries. Some of those countries had very high GNI per capita, and it was obvious that they needed to transition off, and they made that transition quite easily. What we have with the accelerated transition countries, though, is that they're close to that threshold line, and their growth rates are not very large. But as a whole, for the accelerated transition countries, growth is 4.2% as compared to the transition countries, which is 5%. Government health expenditure as a percent of GDP is much lower. It's 1.5% on average, so that's quite low. WHO has a recommendation that it should be 5%, right? But transition countries are also below that at 2.8%. And then you can see differences in human development indexes and UHC service delivery indexes, with the accelerated transition countries being much lower on those. An interesting statistic is the difference between the two groups in terms of the share of external support to the health sector. For transition countries, it's about 3%, and for those 10 accelerated transition countries, that's nearly 30%. So, nearly a tenfold difference. And looking more at GDP growth, you can see that for the accelerated transition countries, you have a kind of this big dip here that happened during the COVID pandemic, and some kind of recovery from that. For the transition countries, there was also a dip, not as deep, but growth is kind of flat, right, among most of those countries. Debt sustainability is also an issue for both the accelerated transition countries and transition countries. And you can see that there are several countries that are in debt distress that are accelerated transition countries. So these are countries that have to take out special arrangements with the IMF to stabilize their economies. But we also have a group of countries, both in transition status and accelerated transition status, that are at very high risk of debt distress. So these are things that we're watching. You saw previously the rise in co-financing, and also I think underneath what Anthony showed you is that countries are introducing vaccines all along this pathway. So that partially accounts for the growth in the numbers, right? If you have more vaccines, you're paying more. But also the fact that countries are moving up GNI per capita and are moving into these kind of accelerated transition groupings also contribute to that. And I think total it's nearly 2 billion in resources, and countries have utilized that to pay for vaccines over this period. There's been analysis, of course, we're concerned with affordability, whether or not the vaccine programs, the portfolio of vaccines is affordable given what a country is required to co-finance. And for the most part, for the accelerated transition countries, it's below 2% of government health spending. You can see for Nigeria, it pops up to about 4%. This was last year's data, so it might be slightly different for this year. But I think this is just a calculation, right, that's made, but I'll talk a little bit later about what it's really like in the budget for countries. And then another difference is that transition countries here have not introduced as many vaccines as countries in accelerated transition. So they moved out of Gavi, say before certain vaccines were available. For example, the HPV vaccine was only available a couple of years ago, and some of the countries had transitioned before that availability, so they didn't have the opportunity to introduce those vaccines. So one of the things I did some research looking at budget structure for sustainability, and I kind of concluded that the budget structure at country level is really important for that. Two examples is that in Djibouti, for example, the EPI was funded out of this direction of priority health programs, which included 10 programs. So for that one budget line, you're funding the government's contribution to 10 programs. So a lot of competing priorities there. And so kind of how it would play out at the country level would be, kind of haphazard, I suppose, how much went to each of those programs. In Bangladesh, for example, the immunization programs financed out of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, vaccines accounted for 84% of the EPI budget, and 74% 4% of the entire MNCH, adolescent health budget. So it's taking up, 3/4 of all of the kind of preventive services that are budgeted for at the country level. And so that's really showing that, okay, while countries are, kind of fulfilling their requirements for co-financing, it's potentially crowding out other programs at the country level in terms of the availability of financing. So these are issues that I think we need to be concerned with, and we need to probably work more on understanding kind of the budgeting process for immunization and vaccines at country level. This was an interesting, I'm glad Anne-Kate presented Cote d'Ivoire, because I thought this was really, my jaw dropped when I discovered this. But 13 steps to get a budget approval. So if you make a request, EPI manager is making a request to spend some money, it's going to take 13 steps to get that money. And then, or to even make that request, and it takes another 13 steps to get the disbursement. So 26 steps in all, and this wasn't unusual when I looked across the 10 countries, that it's very common to have kind of, this is an EPI specific, immunization specific, this is for the whole government sector. But you can see how kind of that larger PFM, public financial management layer really affects the ability of programs to function well. So general observations about immunization is related to planning and budgeting. So some countries, Djibouti and Sao Tome, for example, there was no budget ceiling for health. So when the country was asked to budget, when the health ministry was asked to budget, they weren't given any number that they had to budget up to. I'm looking at Dan because I know he was responsible for this in this country. So that just tells you that for people that might not live and breathe budgeting, that it might be challenging to actually create the budget for health in those countries. There's very low capacity at national and sub-national levels, planning, budgeting, and financial management. The budgets across all of those 10 countries, none of them actually fully covered the co-financing requirements. So this is why in some countries, needing to utilize World Bank loan. In other countries, it's a top line, special emergency allocation that might be made to fund co-financing. So this is troubling. And then, of course, budget execution issues, and then that translates into lack of funding at operational levels. So while we, might be able to purchase the vaccine, there's a limited ability to utilize resources, government resources to deliver, and hence the reliance on donor financing sometimes to come in for per diems and things like that. And of course, donor support for vaccines and immunization are declining. I think in 2021, this is the latest figure I could pull up, the development assistance for all of health was 84 billion, but it's expected to fall to less than half of that in 2025. So that is, a big shock to the system. The U.S. was the largest donor, about $12.4 billion per year. And of course, European donors have also downward adjusted their support. And then after 2025, donor support is expected to remain stagnant at that level. Obviously, immunization and vaccines have been affected, and we have the withdrawal of the U.S. assistance from Gavi. So this is going to be an interesting period that we enter into. So can countries successfully transition? I think both countries, both accelerated and transition, are facing strong economic headwinds. Health spending is stagnant, donor support is contracting. We still have, budgetary issues in terms of being prepared, fully able to absorb the full costs. There might be some favoring of new vaccines over traditional vaccines at country level. And with the withdrawal of support, countries might be in a situation of maybe deciding which vaccines to keep in their program since they can't fully afford. And so this afternoon session will be interesting because we're going to be talking about the prioritization. And this week the Gavi board is meeting to kind of decide on future policies. So this will be an interesting time. I think the way forward is really having to optimize the vaccine portfolio. A lot of countries have taken on vaccines that are actually the most expensive version of the vaccine. So maybe shifting to a lower cost version. HPV doesn't have to be given in multiple doses. You can give one dose, so shifting to different kinds of delivery. I think strengthening forecasting and procurement processes is very important. I did some work on Nigeria years ago where, kind of just a different shift in the assumptions for forecasting resulted in millions of dollars different in the budget. So if that's the case, like how do you actually budget and plan if those small little assumptions and shifts result in such a big difference? I think we really need to work on the budgetary structure. I'm not a big advocate for creating rigidity in budgets. I think it's really important for countries to be able to allocate funding as they need it, but for visibility reasons, I think it might be important for some countries that don't yet have it to create a budget line specific for vaccines and immunization. And Gavi funding needs to be brought more on budget. It was really heartening to see for Solomon Islands. It was a country that actually had Gavi commodities and health system strengthening support reflected in their budget, so that as they transition, they would need to know that they need to fill in those gaps, right? And I'm being told that I need to move along, but you can read the rest of this. Thank you very much.
So colleagues, I hope you are listening through this presentation. So Anthony said the countries have to be ready, and Logan just said they have to be prepared. I argue that there is a difference between being ready and being prepared, but we'll see if Congo is ready or prepared.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Soazic Elise Wang. I'm an economist in the Health, Nutrition and Population Department of the World Bank. And I think Logan and Anthony made my job a little bit easier by laying the theoretical background of transitioning out of Gavi support. And I'm going to dig deeper into empirical evidence from 2 lower middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have also recently signed the Abidjan Declaration that Anthony mentioned of moving away from Gavi support in the next 5 years. And those 2 countries are the Republic of Congo, not to confuse with the demographic Republic of Congo. So it's a 5 million inhabitant countries in the middle of Africa, in Central Africa, and Sao Tome and Principe, which is now also one of the smallest countries in Africa. It's a little island of 250,000 people. So both the Republic of Congo and Sao Tome and Principe are currently in the Gavi accelerated transition phase. And as Anthony clearly explained, this basically means that they've passed the eligibility threshold based on their gross national income per capita, and that in the next 5 years they should allocate in terms of co-financing share, they should reach 100%. So for Congo, the country in principle should reach their transition in the next 2 years. That was around 2026, 2027, and in Sao Tome and Principe as well. So these are two countries that the World Bank with Gavi have been supporting in the next 2 years in fostering their transition by undertaking key analytical studies such as immunization financing, system assessment, but also fiscal space analysis. And according to a recent costing exercise that was completed by UNICEF and the World Bank, we've estimated that to sustainably transition out of Gavi support and finance immunization and vaccine by 2030, the Republic of Congo should devote at least 1% of its general government budget to vaccine and almost a quarter of total government health expenditure annually to reach the transition in the next 5 years. And in Sao Tome and Principe, we've also reached the conclusion that the government should devote at least 1.5% of the state budget to immunization and vaccine, and at least 10% of total general government health expenditure annually to reach the transition. So how is that going to be made? I think Logan clearly explained it. We are in a very economically distressed context with the withdrawal of total technical financial partners. So what are the core domestic resource mobilization options that those two countries can rely on to reach to successfully transition from Gavi support in the next 5 years? So what we did is basically doing a macroeconomic fiscal space analysis where we are trying to assess the budgetary capacity of those countries by identifying potential funding sources for primary healthcare and immunization program in the long run. So we are projecting, we are using projection and mathematical decomposition methods to have a sense of what is the real and nominal general government health expenditure, and what would be that share if the country rely on each of these 5 core pillars. The first one is whether they can rely on the conducive macroeconomic condition, basically the GDP growth rate in the next 5 years, to create more fiscal space and generate more income for health and immunization. The second is whether they can reprioritize health and immunization in their government budget to reach, say, the 15% Abuja target. And the third one is whether they can rely on domestic assistance for health. So basically, try to, keep on relying on technical and financial partners to generate more income for health and immunization. Last but not least, we also look at tax to GDP ratio, so the capacity of the government to collect more revenues to increase fiscal space for health, and finally whether they can instead kind of correct some technical inefficiencies in their health system. So improving efficiencies to generate more income and more revenue for the health sector. So what we did is, which is again the traditional methodology of fiscal space analysis that the World Bank and UNICEF as well have been working on, is going through each of those pillars and having 5 core scenarios, where the baseline scenario is basically the status quo, where the country, by looking at how the GDP per capita will grow in the next 5 years, and we use data from the World Economic Outlook from the IMF, whether that this considering this baseline scenario and comparing it with other scenario where we basically change how much the country can collect more taxes in the second scenario and compare with the baseline scenario. In the third scenario, we basically look at whether fiscal space can be generated by improving budget execution rate, which is known to be very low in those low middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And fourth is whether by prioritizing health in the general government budget that can create additional fiscal space. So what we had here, and this is the case of Congo. So the first panel on the top panel is basically the potential of each of those pillars, which are summarized through the different scenarios. So the left-hand side is the baseline scenario that I was talking about, where we basically just assume that the country will increase fiscal space by only relying on its GDP growth, so how it will vary as projected by the IMF. The second scenario is whether by improving tax collection efforts, by mimicking it to the average tax to GDP ratio in other lower middle income countries that are comparable to Congo in this case, whether they can indeed create more fiscal space. The third one is whether if they enhance their budget execution rates to a certain level. Again here we compare with the peers average of budget execution rates in other lower middle income countries that have already transitioned. And the last one is whether if they reprioritize and reach up to 15% of the budget allocated to the health sector by 2030, whether that can actually generate more income. And what we can see here is indeed that reprioritization is one of the pillars where, in the case of Congo, income can nearly double between the baseline scenario, which is solely relying on GDP growth, and the scenario where the country is increasing reprioritizing health to reach 15% by 2030. And we use this fiscal space analysis for the health sector to then generate, the projected domestic general government spending on immunization for the next 5 years by looking at how the population of children to be vaccinated will grow and the total population. And we can also at least clearly see that from the graph on the second graph on the bottom panel that reprioritization, even for immunization, is indeed the most important leverage in terms of option that the government can rely on to significantly generate additional revenues or income for health and immunization. In Sao Tome and Principe, we did the same exercise by going through each of these pillars, and we again can clearly see that by relying on reprioritization as a lever or pillar, the government can nearly double the real general government health expenditure in the next 5 years, and therefore, improve fiscal space for health. And the same goes for immunization as well. And as I said, to kind of have a projection of how domestic general government spending on immunization will also grow, we use how the trend of the population growth of the country and how the total number of children to be vaccinated will also increase throughout the next 5 years from 2025, our baseline, to 2030. So what is the bottom line here? So going through each of those pillars, the first one being the baseline scenario where the country solely rely on the prospect of the GDP growth per capita to increase in the next 5 years, we can clearly see that this is considered as a very low leverage, given the very unfavorable macroeconomic environment. And as Logan mentioned, most of these countries, especially Sao Tome, is in debt distress and a risk of insolvency. So this lever is actually very low in terms of fiscal space option for domestic resource mobilization. But rather, the country should keep on striving to reprioritize health in the budget, maintaining the priority level for countries such as Congo, which is already nearly around 30%, if not increasing it to the 15% Abuja target. This remains a relatively large leverage. Secondly, we also saw that efficiency in health expenditure, basically here mimicking by improving the budget execution rate in the health sector, is a substantial leverage to improve domestic resource mobilization and fiscal space for health and immunization. And clearly, keep on relying on external financing has a very limited leverage, considering the context of external disengagement of core technical and financial partners, as highlighted by Logan in her presentation. In Sao Tome and Principe particularly, we've been thinking about creating a basket fund as a way to kind of mobilize more resources for the health sector. This is very nascent. And this is also one of the core implications of this fiscal space analysis, which was then used by the government to launch earlier this month, on July 4th, the very first health financing and immunization strategy of the country, where options such as prioritization, efficiency, and increasing of revenue through more tax collection or improving tax collection effort were clearly highlighted thanks to this exercise that was completed last June. In Congo, we are currently working with UNICEF. Alex, we had a discussion on that with Gavi, the WHO and Gavi, to finalize the very first health and immunization financing strategy by August 31st. So we have a draft of red already, and this fiscal space analysis that was completed was also used by the government and to have this first draft and lay the different options very, very clearly. We are planning a high-level advocacy event in Congo for the month of September, where we will be convening core policymakers from the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Health, Planning, and Budget to keep on advocating for enhanced domestic resource mobilization in the health sector by highlighting those fiscal space options that are more promising to enhance resources for health and immunization. Thank you, and I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Elise. I'm going to invite Daniel. I mean, he has the bad luck to be the last presenter. We don't have that much time. We are running a bit behind time, so please try to make it short so we can get questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Daniel Osei is my name, from Ghana, and I work within Ghana doing some finance and immunization financing for Gavi. This morning is an interesting story about the journey, the checkered journey of Ghana through the Gavi transition. The key objectives here is really to provide the perspective of how we've traveled through this journey, to reflect on some of the systemic challenges that we faced, and also share with you some of the lessons that we think will benefit countries, especially those who are in the accelerated transition period, for Gavi itself and then for the global audience. Indeed, the journey has been one dating back from the beginning of Gavi, when the support started, and in 2 years into the support, the whole idea came that Gavi says, how do we transition? Because it was a 5-year program, and so we started with what we call the Financial Sustainability Plan at that time. All countries that started at that time were supposed to do a 5-year plan on how they will transition after 5 years. Interestingly, our big brother Nigeria says after 5 years we'll go back to DBT3, DBT use. Interestingly, what happened with Ghana is that we said, okay, can Gavi extend the 5-year support in terms of funding to a 10-year support, and we'll begin a co-financing from year 2. So they extended to 10 years. Interestingly, along the line of the journey, Gavi came up with much bigger and much better idea of supporting financing $0.2 of the vaccine. So we all went back, and then we began that journey into the support and supporting with $0.2. And along the line, we had this whole policy, which now begins to look at a better way of doing the transition. So Ghana, we've gone along with that one. We entered in and out 2015, 2017 of accelerated mode, but we are back 2022, and the way forward looks like there is no turning back. And so at the moment, we are poised, as you've seen some of the past the presentations, that we are going to transition in 29, and 2030 would be the first full year Ghana is going to fully fund its vaccines. The journey has been a checkered one, and the challenges have been very much of economic challenges within the period of around 2009 right to now. Ghana has gone in and out of IMF 3 times. And if you check with some of the challenges that we face, especially we've defaulted 2013, 2014, 2016, 2018. In fact, in 2022, Ghana did not pay, but paid the full in 2023 first quarter, and paid 60% of our 2023 in the second quarter. So you see that we have had some challenges, and most of them are a reason of economic challenges within the economy, the issues of going in and out. There are other areas also that we face these challenges. They are mainly to do with PFM systems that have been talked about sometimes, the visibility of the budget for immunization, also the fact that the disbursement cycles of the PFM, and sometimes the cash flow doesn't allow for the full disbursement ahead of time for you to be able to procure your vaccines ahead. If you are doing quarterly or monthly releases, you can't do that with procurement of vaccines. So that is one big challenge. The technical also constraint with ability for the team in-house is budgeted to be able to estimate clearly the cost of the vaccines and all of that, and we'll be receiving support from UNICEF. That has been. There is a big push there from the political will. Political economy is very big in this picture. How they prioritize immunization is so important. How you sell the message to the politicians is so important. And that has also contributed much. Their understanding and perception of what you want in terms of immunization. Why not HIV? Why not TB? Why not NCDs? Why not NTDs? Gavi is there supporting you. Why should we push all our money to where the bigger support is and leave the other lean areas? So these are things that really influence how you do the budget negotiations and convince politicians. But lastly, also the fact that you need to look at how you deal with the community, civil society organizations, interactions with the community to be able to provide that understanding for parliamentarians, for policymakers, and all of that. We had good opportunities that we've gone through, we had throughout the journey. The health sector have a health sector partnership committee that was very strong. We have a health financing strategy. We have a health financing technical working group. So you have these discussions going on and on. We have in the immunization side, we have the NITAG, we have the ICC that meets to discuss these issues. So there was positive opportunities for us to take advantage of this, to always go and discuss issues around immunization to see how best we can get our way through. But the potential source of vaccines throughout the period has been from the National Health Insurance Levy. This is VAT-based. It is statutory. So that money, when collected, goes into a fund and it's used to fund the health insurance. There's a 10% of it that can be used for health improvement. And this is where the big source of co-financing comes from. Very secure. And so it was a big opportunity for us. Even though it's not enough, that 10% window is also very competitive because we use some to co-finance ARVs for TB medicines, for malaria, as well as immunization. So it's also a competitive window. And it depends on how you negotiate with it. As I mentioned, we have the NITAG. Also, the CSO played a key role in terms of their always advocacy role that they had to play. One with legislators and others, and two also with the community to be able to bring out that. But lastly, also building capacity for doing some of these things in the PFM in terms of bringing it out for us to see visibility in budget lines for not necessarily a one budget immunization line, but within the PFM chart of account system, how can you identify cost lines for all the various areas? Because the interest is not just immunization, it's all the other program areas. And that support also has been helpful, which is part of the role that I'm playing now. So what are implications for countries? The lessons is that start early. It's very important. When I mentioned about the financial sustainability plan, Ghana thought about it, but the money was so small, it was just one vaccine, so we thought we could do it. But as it expands, there were challenges. So we need to start early. Just like the athletes relay, you don't need to wait for the baton to come before you move. You must move ahead of the baton. So you must move when you are looking at your eligibility, at your GNI, and then begin to plan. As I said, political economy analysis is very critical. You need to be able to psych the minds of the politicians. They should have a message that the community or the people would love to hear. And if they hear it well, then they know that they have a message for them and they are in a win-win situation. We needed to embed the PFM systems, really to look at it and make sure that it reflects in terms of how can we know that immunization is being financed in the budget. It's a big black box and you need some powerful microscopes to be able to go in and identify whether it is being financed or not and whether it is enough. Because Ghana has an integrated health system, and so we don't have a programmatic that there's budget for TB, HIV, malaria, and all of that. That is also one. But also the local champions from the CSO has been very vital. We have the CSO community for immunization that works very hard on bringing visibility of the immunization situation within the country. Implications for Gavi and partners, and I think that one of the things we've realized is that Gavi has been very flexible along the line in this whole process of transition. As you go along, we all observed that there are groupings of countries begin to look at countries in distress, countries and this and that, and they tailor-made to look to see situations of countries to be able to adapt. So that has been very good in terms of how we have come along with Gavi. The scope of the support is very important, especially the post-transition. I think one of the lessons is that we should look at supporting countries to be able to look forward to how do they mobilize domestic resources and what kind of, and I think the previous discussions touched much on that one, what is possible and what is not possible. And so all those analyses are very important. And as I said, Gavi has been very supportive in terms of adopting that off-ramping. Whenever you have a problem, Gavi has a way of pushing you into a certain zone to be able to support you to come back. Ghana has gone in and out because IHEA and I go and then something happens and it comes down and then we have to go back from eligibility to a lower level. So that has been something that has been very supportive in our journey. But for others, a reflection for the global, I think it's important that we all begin to look at how do we harmonize this transition process. And I think now it's very, very important because we see that it is not just Gavi. We see a lot of risk alongside other partner support. And therefore, we should begin to look at harmonizing the transition process so that we do not ramp that in 2027, another donor is going to start the transition processes, and one starts in 2029 and 2031. And then you find countries then say, we've given up. Let's go back to where we belong to. We'll be fine with that. So I think it's very important to avoid that parallel transition agendas and encourage pool financing where we can pool things and see how we can finance at country level. In terms of transition, I think the partners should look at how they can invest in global diplomacy. When you have country CEOs coming down and meeting the top politicians and talking to them. I think it takes, and through that you get them to make some commitments that they are held to. And so it's a very good tool to use. But also it is good that we have that rapport of South-South collaboration to learn from each other as to how have we come through. Maybe we have similar situations. Can we use World Bank to pay for vaccines? Can we do this? Can we do this? What are the possibilities? And I think that is something that we need to look for. So the final reflection is that our story has been one of resilience, experimental, and we've always under fiscal pressure. In the last 3 governments that have rolled, every one of them either ends with an IMF program. Then the next comes to go off, and it goes into IMF before it exits. So it's really been, but it's been fiscal pressure and much more resilience, but it's been experimental and innovation, trying to look at what is possible at every particular time. I think the message is that transition is not an endpoint, it's the catalyst to a system transformation. So let's not look at it that we're doing a transition to 2030, in the case of Ghana. What happens after 2030? We need to go on with it. And I think that we need to have a plan that extends beyond 2030 for that discussion, and not just a roadmap that ends maybe 2030, because we need to be interested in what happens afterwards. Countries need to also define the sources, as I said, beyond the post-transition financing, and look at how do you sustain that financing post-transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are really on time. Yeah, just one round. Please come in, guys. While we are getting here, I want to just summarize quickly by saying that we have so many opportunities that you can see in the presentation. There are many declarations. There is Paris, there is Accra, there is Lusaka, but we don't have Abidjan. The one thing we don't have actually is a single way to transition from donor support. It doesn't exist. There is no harmony. There is no consensus, and I think that's the main message. Please, let's take a question here. Oh my God,
Thank you so much. I was wondering if I think probably the first 2 presenters in particular could say something a bit more about the scope of the financing that you're talking about, in terms of, are we only talking about the vaccines themselves, because vaccines are not useful if you do not have health workers to deliver those vaccines, and particularly basic things like outreach from health facilities that doesn't happen because the health workers are there but they don't have money for fuel for the vehicles, so they don't do the vaccine outreach, or given these constrained times and all the cuts and many different things going on, will there even be the health workers there to deliver the vaccines? And then I was wondering if the final speaker from Ghana could say anything about the what I thought seemed like exciting announcements from the government this year about greatly increasing the financing of the NHIS and sort of, I think, a complete change in how primary healthcare is being financed, but in the context also of other slides that were saying Ghana is at significant risk of defaulting on debt.
Thank you very much. For the scenario analysis for Tome and then Congo, I was just wondering, for your analysis showing that the reprioritization has the most impact, is that possible at all? I mean, it looks good on the slide, but I'm not sure if that can actually be translated into actual reprioritization. Do you have any historical evidence that this works or could work?
My kind of comment and question is, we use GDP per capita. International institutions use this for transition, so multiple transitions get triggered at the same time as countries graduate. GDP per capita is only loosely correlated with revenue generation within countries. Some countries prioritize FDs, like foreign direct investment attraction and economic growth through tax policies that are not scaling with that growth. They have preferential tax treatment for high growth sectors. So as the economies grow from a GDP per capita perspective, the revenues don't necessarily grow at that same pace. Some countries do that, some countries don't. Some countries get revenue from natural resources that they have in other ways. And it seems that that process of revenue generation through taxation is ignored. We pretend it's all based on income taxes, like in high income countries, and that's going to grow as the economy grows, but that's not the reality. And that's part of the reason we see these differential successes at transition. So what can we do more to incorporate actual tax revenue generation processes and systems into our thinking about transition as international organizations? And then also what can we do as a community to connect our work as an investment that generates not only economic returns in sort of GDP per capita and growth or whatever, but also revenue returns? Can we do pullouts on our evaluation that showcase that investing in health and immunization results in revenue generation within that system as a return on investment that ministries of finance can then use and be like, oh, we're getting something concrete back from this investment that we can actually see on paper, not just a credit impact.
I have a bit of similar question, but the transition tracks co-financing, which is primarily the procurement of vaccines, and it comes to outcomes to look at the audit coverage, which is a bit simplistic in its way, but are we tracking full system cost burden? And if we are not tracking it, is there a risk that in 5 to 10 years after the transition has happened, that these countries could actually start backtracking in the immunization programs?
I found the fiscal space analysis very interesting, and I wanted to understand whether there's evidence that we can generate that would help countries prioritize health more. What sort of evidence can we generate as researchers to help with that process?
Thanks for the great presentation. I think my question is quite short. Can we call it true sustainability and transition if we are moving to funding the vaccines through World Bank loans?
Thanks everyone. Continue from Chai. Great question. What have we learned from the mixed approach under Gavi 5.0/5.1? So how did the relationship or like support Gavi give the countries evolve as country transition with the phase 1 countries, wave 1 that Logan mentioned? And then how would Gavi engage MDBs in those set of countries, and how can we better leverage them to ensure that there's no backsliding with what was mentioned?
So mine is to
Mine is a very basic one. So I would be curious to understand, like, what does actually transition mean? Like for India, though we consider it as transition, still we are continuing with some support to India. Is it so for the other countries also, or is it like complete cessation of all support?
Alright, so mine is to the Ghana presenter. In the course of this domestic resource mobilization for vaccine financing, where the challenges really centered on government releases to fund this vaccine and co-financing, or holistically, there's really no availability of finances within the government space.
Okay, thank you. Let me start just from that. Yeah, the challenges were both. One was about the availability of the financing. In fact, what happened along the line, right from 2016, was that the reliable source, which was the health insurance, was capped. Was capped means that if they should have 100% release, they've been capped, for example, like up to 65%, 70%. It means that only 70% will be released for that health insurance work, and the 30% will be discretionary to support government budget. That means it limits how much also will be released to that. So that was one. And the second was also the releases. I mean, the releases were slow. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. As I said, in 2022, there were no release. I mean, due to some COVID pressure and other domestic, but they are both. And that sends me to the first question, because some of the things that have happened lately, one is that capping of the health insurance has been uncapped. So a lot more money have now been available for spending, which would also enhance how much we spend on immunization, and more specifically vaccines. And I'll come to that of the other costs in the immunization program. But also the government has announced, because of the government has announced the free primary health care. That makes money available to support the other costs of immunization and other programs as far as they are within the primary health care sphere. So it releases more money for that spending, and that makes it much more that it will improve the immunization funding that comes to that. I think these are the direct two questions to Ghana.
Yeah, so great questions. I'll pick up the last one on the availability of financing when financing is needed, the timing of disbursement. Actually, no one yet mentioned the Vaccine Independence Initiative, which is a pre-financing that several countries use. So they use it when the disbursement has not been made, but they need to pay UNICEF for their shipment of vaccines, and so that can be facilitated through a revolving prepayment mechanism. And I think there's more and more donation to that mechanism, so it's available to more and more countries. Mercy's question about is it transition if you can finance through the World Bank? Well, World Bank lending to countries is country money, and it's entirely fungible. So it's up to how the country wants to utilize those funds. Personally, I mean, I think using lending for a situation that's more of a crisis makes sense, because then you can grow out of it and repay it. But as a long-term strategy of taking out loans repeatedly, it's not the greatest strategies, I think. And let's see, and then the last one would be Brian's question about can we incorporate more tax information into our calculus, basically around transition. And I think that's a great suggestion, and I think it's something that we probably need to do more of through transition planning. That's the opportunity to really dig deeper, kind of look greater at all of these different macroeconomic indicators, and also look more deeply at budget structure, etc. So I think the transition planning process is really that opportunity. I'll turn it over to Andre.
Thanks. So just some of the questions about co-financing was included in the presentation earlier. So the co-financing is just vaccines and devices. It's from the Gavi side. As I mentioned, it's an incomplete picture of countries' total vaccine needs as traditional vaccines, HSS, and technical support, ops costs that are not included in that. But kind of from a data readiness and availability, it provides some illustration of kind of the trajectories and what's kind of in store for the countries and how much they pay. So I think that addresses your question, Aman, and yours as well. In terms of transition in India, they transitioned out in 2022, so they're out of regular Gavi support kind of in the model, but transition countries do have opportunity to get vaccine support through our mixed approach, as well as kind of one-off catalytic support. And I know this is happening in India for, I think, an HPV introduction that's coming, and potentially some other things. So it's not regular routine support over the years, but there's still opportunities where Gavi can support in those countries as well.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for the question on group monetization. And we do agree that it's very challenging for countries, especially those that are in debt distress, to mobilize enough domestic resources to the health sector and reach the 15% Abuja target. But we've been having some evidence, especially in Southern Africa, like Botswana, Eswatini, Namibia, and recently Cape Verde, that are all countries that have managed to nearly pass the 15% Abuja target. So it's doable, but we also recognize and acknowledge that corporatization goes hand in hand with correcting potential technical and allocative inefficiencies in the health sector, meaning that those countries need to enhance their budget execution rate and find a way to potentially close some leakage gap that can happen throughout the process of allocating the funding through the proper execution of those monies. So the government can still allocate money, but the government cannot really absorb all those funding, which is what we are seeing in most lower middle income countries like Republic of Congo, for instance, and also Sao Tome. So privatization is challenging, that's the bottom line, but still doable since we have best practice of countries in Southern Africa, but also working more and more in improving efficiency of health expenditure is important to really tap into one of the most promising route that country can use to really enhance the fiscal base for health and immunization.
Thank you so much, Abby. So we don't have time for a second now, so we're going to move to the next session. And I know we have 18 in your time, but we'll just close by saying I don't want to take time anymore. Just to say that I initially planned to ask you at the end of the presentation to vote and open the vote on, do you think you should, if you are a country, should you be ready by the donor planning process, or should you be prepared based on your own needs that you have identified? Being ready or being prepared is I think it's an essential question that every country should face at some point. And we should leave the space for countries to do that and not. Yeah, I will stop there. Laura is looking at me very severely. I was a poor moderator, sorry.
Otherwise everybody gets angry with me for not having a break at all. So please be back at 10:15. Thanks.